Oh, that was a little weak. Let's try that again. Good morning. Great. Good to see everyone here this morning. A few announcements before we begin. We have a gospel meeting coming up starting the 6th of October, lasting through the 10th of October. The general theme is the Great Commission. It will be 6 different men of the congregation doing the preaching. So go out and get your neighbors ready to attend and come and do that. More information will follow on that. Cheryl Lynn's already been working up the flyers and different things. So also, Andrea and I will leave this Wednesday going to Arkansas and won't be back until the following Tuesday. We'll try to come home Monday, but we might be back, might not. This will be our first trip in over 47 years that we don't have to be anywhere. Her last day of work was last Friday. Prior to that, we had to arrange for me to be back for military duties or her to be at work. So this is our first, I guess you could call it, vacation of freedom. We need to keep a lot of folks in our thoughts and prayers. Sister Haney has found out that she is stage 2 cirrhosis of the liver. She's got an appointment the 1st of October to figure out what they're going to do and the plan of treatment for that. Keep Emma still has at least 1 stone. One passed one, got one. Keep Terry in your prayers always. Janice is still having her esophageal problem. Holly is not doing well at all. They have her last appointment this past Thursday, I think it was. No, Wednesday. One day this past week up in Birmingham, her spine, the bones are deteriorating and shifting, and they're planning another surgery for her. And it looks like it might be in the month of November. So she is in a lot of pain right now. Tina is home, doing some better. I think that's, Lisa just got back, and Luke said that she had planned on being here for service today, just not Bible study, and was hacking and coughing a bunch last night. And what they had done with her was, well, without getting too graphic, they go in and stretch and expand. She had a lot of inflammation in the tubes, the bronchial tubes. So we need to keep her in our prayers. They're trying to figure out what's causing all of that. So to miss anybody else. Brother Jim Cox, would you lead us in a prayer, please? Amen. Book of Leviticus, chapter 17. Leviticus, chapter 17. Brother Jeremy Day and I was talking about it this past Wednesday night after his class that it looked like that we wouldn't have any problem moving forward and doing another 16 chapters or so to finish off this book by splitting it up, me taking 8 today, but I don't think I'm going to get through 4 because there's one thing that I want to park on and talk about a little bit. And it happens in the first chapter. But anyway, chapter 17 begins the same way that a lot of the chapters begin. The Lord spake to Moses. The Lord is telling Moses what to do and what to tell the folks. And the first section, verses 1 through 9, deals with where the sacrifice is to be. It admonishes them not outside the camp, they're to bring it to the tabernacle, etc. So it gives you the location of where the sacrifice is to be made or carried out. Then we get down to verse 10. Verse 10 says, and whatsoever man there be of the house of Israel or of the strangers that sojourn among you that eateth any manner of blood, I will even set my face against that soul that eateth blood, and will cut him off from amongst his people. Now, this is not exactly a new command in the Mosaical law. If you go back into Genesis chapter 9, who are we dealing with there? What person of the Bible are we dealing with in chapter 9 of Genesis? Give you a hint. It has to deal with a big boat. Big boat. Noah. When Noah comes off the ark, what is he told to do? That they can eat animals, but what? Not eat the blood. So even under the patriarchal period, they were instructed not to eat blood. Here we get into the Mosaical period where they're told not to eat blood. And the reason I wanted to pause and talk about this one a little bit is years ago, I had a person that worked for me of a different religious upbringing. He needed surgery. He had cancer. He needed surgery. And he was refusing the surgery because they had instructed him he might need to have some blood given. And that was back in the day before they had the knowledge that they have today. Today, it wouldn't be an issue because they now know how to take and store blood and use their own blood. But back in those days, they didn't have that technology. So he came to me knowing that I always had a Bible on my desk, so he figured I might know a little bit. So we started talking, and I said, well, the only way I know to do this is you ask me questions. I will give you Bible verses and discuss it with you. You go back and talk to your main person and bring me another set of questions. So we went back and forth for a couple of weeks, and he decided that their particular group really wasn't on the path that the Bible was talking about. So he decided that he would have the surgery. Fortunately, he had the surgery. Everything worked out well. And he didn't even need to have blood. So that alleviated part of his worry. But when we get to the blood, even in our own, in my opinion anyway, God had prepared people so they would know how to do things. And mankind lost a bunch of knowledge dealing with the human body and all, because even in 1799, George Washington died because of the physicians not knowing how to properly treat him. Now, when you go back and look at that all the material that has been written by doctors later, they say that he didn't die of blood loss. He died of there's a little flap that's right at the top of your windpipe that opens and closes, the epiglottis, and it was inflamed, and they think that he died of epiglottitis. However, the physicians of the day hastened his demise because they used blister treatment and bloodletting. And depending on which group you put your faith in as being more correct, they had bled him 35 to 40% of his blood volume. For those in here that know the nurses and the the EMTs and people like that. Once you get down in below, when you lose at least 30%, you're getting into grave danger. So they at least hastened his demise. But back to that religious group, they think their idea is that the blood, because of what it says later in here, that the blood is the life force, that everything is in the blood. And that's why the physicians treating George Washington blistered him, trying to draw the blood in a different direction, and let so much blood out, as they thought that everything was in the blood. Well, we know today that the blood is absolutely the life force, but for a different reason than they thought. Your blood today, we know that blood regulates body temperature, takes all the nutrients to the different systems of the body, feeds the body, and removes the waste. So the blood is the life force, but not the way that religious group, and not the way that some physicians thought in the 1800s. And when we get down here, verse 11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you upon the altar to make an atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that maketh atonement for the soul." I don't know if you've really thought about it, but I want you to look at verse 11. Read it to yourself, because in it, it tells two reasons why they were not to eat blood. What are those two reasons? Life and atonement. In essence, though, I guess the point I want to drive home is that even here, it is symbolism. Because was there any way, they're also told not to eat fat. Well, we know today if you don't cook things with fat, what happens? One, it don't taste good. Two, it don't hold together very well. Some fat is necessary. But even today, the processing method that we have today, is there any way to remove 100% of the blood? No. Is there any way to remove 100% of the fat? Only if you trim it to excess, and then you still have some veins here and there. So, pardon? Well, and the marbling comes from the fat, which is some of the little tissues that are running through. So, and that's why I say it was symbolism. They were not to just do it. And another reason that they weren't to do it is because they were being separated from the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the others. In their religious worship toward pagan gods and all, I hate to get into this area, because even if we come to the American Indian, there are over 500, almost 600 tribes recognized in America as American Indians, different tribes. And they don't follow a central thought. Each tribe has different ways that they worship, different ways that they mourn, different ways that they do things. And most of them have nothing to do with anything like that. But the Lakota, the Sioux, used to, when they were mourning a lost loved one, they would be inflicting themselves with pain. They would be cutting themselves. When we get on down here a little bit later, it tells us not to do things like that also. But primarily, what we need to look at is the contrast. The patriarchal age told them not to eat blood. The Mosaical age told them not to eat blood. But for Christians, what does the New Testament tell us about eating blood? Are we still to shy away from eating blood? We are. Does that mean that all those folks in England that like their black pudding that's made with blood and all, that they are doing wrong? You would think so? Let's look at some verses in the New Testament then. Let's go to Mark 7. Mark 7, verses 14 through 23. It's a long reading, but I think it's important. Mark 7, 14 through 23. And when he had called all the people unto him, he said unto them, Hearken unto me, every one of you, and understand. There is nothing from without a man that entering into him can defile him. If we stop right there, in the Old Testament, when they're telling them not to eat the blood, what reason was there for not eating the blood? It would defile them. So here he is saying anything without, and this is Christ talking. But the things which come out of him, those are they that defile the man. If any man have ears, let him hear. When he was entered into the house from the people, his disciples asked him concerning the parable, and he said unto them, Are ye so without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatsoever thing from without entereth into a man, it cannot defile him? Because it entereth not into his heart, but into his belly, and goeth out in the draught, purging all meats. And he said, That which cometh out of the man, that defileth the man. And from within, out of the heart of man, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornication, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness, and all these evil things come from within and defile the man. Look at Acts chapter 15. Verse 5 and verse 20. 15, verse 5 and verse 20. But there arose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. Verse 20. But that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols and from fornication and from things strangled and from blood. Because the Pharisees rose up and complained and brought up the questions, then they're told to abstain from those things. Romans 3 and verse 25. Romans 3 and 25. Whom God had set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of God, meaning atoning for the victims. And Romans 14, last one, Romans 14, verses 13 through 23. Again, another long reading. 13 through 23 in chapter 14 of Romans. Let us therefore judge one another. Let us not therefore judge one another anymore, but judge this rather, that no man put a stumbling block or an occasion to fall in his brother's way. I know and am persuaded by the Lord Jesus that there is nothing unclean of itself, but to him that esteemeth anything to be unclean, to him it is unclean. But if thy brother be grieved with thy meat, now walkest thou not charitably, destroy not him with thy meat, for whom Christ died. Let not then your good be evil spoken of. For the kingdom of God is not meat and drink, but righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Ghost. For he that in these things serveth Christ is acceptable to God and approved of men. Let us therefore follow after the things which make for peace, and things wherewith one may edify another. For meat destroy not the work of God. All things indeed are pure, but it is evil for that man who eateth with offense. It is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, nor anything whereby thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak. Hast thou faith? Have it to thyself before God. Happy is he that condemneth not himself in that thing which he alloweth, and he that doubteth is damned if he eat, because he eateth not of faith. For whatsoever is not of faith is sin. Now, if I were to put this in a little, try to put it in a little box, back in the Mosaical law, when this is given in the book of Leviticus, they came out of Egypt, pagan gods. They were removed from that. When they're going into Canaan, the Moabites and all of those, they're going into an area where people do these kind of things, and they were to be separated. God even tells them that they are not to worship Molech. What was Molech's number one problem? The god Molech. They sacrificed children to him. They burned children to sacrifice to the god Molech. Christ tells them not to do it. In verse 11 that we parked on for a minute, there are two reasons why. The blood is the life, and the life was to be sacrificed to God. That belongs to God. When we get to the New Testament, the comparison is that we don't have to worry about animal sacrifices anymore. We don't have to worry about life being sacrificed to God anymore, because of why? Christ did it once for everybody. It's a done deal. No more is necessary in that reign. Then when we get into the New Testament era, what takes place between the Jews and the Gentiles? Different religious worships, different things, and he commands them not to eat things given to idols. And then he goes in and tells them not to put stumbling blocks in the way. They are in a transition period in the New Testament where the Jews are finally now assimilating with Gentiles, and Gentiles with Jews coming from different backgrounds, and what one considered a problem, the other didn't, and vice versa. And so they're saying, hey, y'all work it out. Y'all get along. This may be okay, but don't do it if it causes a problem with your brother. And that's the whole concept that goes through there. Questions, comments? Am I on the right path, on the wrong path? You do it every day you eat a meat. Some of us more than others. How many times have you cooked a hamburger and put it on your plate and that red stuff was dripping? You think that's red dye they've put in that meat? Where's that red tint come from? What would I do with that verse? I would put it in the category of because it causes the Jew to stumble. You take it a different way? Okay. And I guess I'm putting it in the same category as because the Pharisees fussed about it and was trying to hold people to the old law into the fact that they needed to be circumcised. They're told that don't count anymore. We're under this set of rules. But Brother Clance brought up an interesting comment there in Acts when the Gentiles were told not to eat things strangled and not to eat blood. Where does that fit? How do we harmonize it? Or is it still a command that we are not to eat, except the stuff we can't get rid of? I'm talking about we can't go out and drink a cup of blood. Where are we? Well, even with the government being involved, making sure everything's clean, we're still not to eat raw meats because we can get trichinosis and a few other bad bloodborne diseases from that. So does that, I'm going to play a Jeremy and then I'm going to have him answer. He raised his hand, not answer, but he's got something to say after I play a Jeremy. Does that mean that I'm perfectly okay because I like my steak well done, but you can't have one rare? Jeremy. I see your hand, Brother Clance. I want to make one comment and then I'll get to you. We could spend weeks on this topic, but I think the main takeaway that we need to look at is when this is written and when this was put down and given to them, he wanted them to understand that a blood sacrifice, a life, was required for their sin. And then we connect that to the New Testament. The life, the blood that was for sin was Christ. And that we don't need to do that anymore. It's been done the one time and we're good to go. Brother Clark. Correct. That's correct. Many things that go into the physical body hurt the physical body, and in turn could have an effect on the spiritual. Now that I've got you totally confused and got you thinking about, we're gonna move on. We're gonna get down to chapter 18. The first part of chapter 18 deals with the law of incest. And it's telling who you can get close to, who you can marry, who you can't marry, and things of that nature. And verse 3 starts out with, after the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwell, shall you not do. And after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, shall you not do. Neither shall you walk in their ordinances. Ye shall do my judgments and keep mine ordinances to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. None of you shall approach to any that is near of kin to him to uncover their nakedness. I am the Lord. The general phrase, uncover the nakedness, just has to do with sexual relations. But I wanted to point out that when he brought them out of the land of Egypt and going into the land of Canaan, he was very precise in this statement that they were not to follow what the Egyptians did. They were not to follow what the Canaanites and those in those lands were going to do. They were their own people, and they were to do only what God said to do. When we get down to the marrying aspect, and we'll learn about that in different books and different chapters later, but they were not to intermarry with those people either. Why? Well, they were special. They were their own people, but by intermarrying, what was taking place? What was they forbidden to intermarry because they were Canaanites? No. They had a different religious base, and God was telling them to stay away because he was telling them to stay away from strange gods, strange idols. This is the way you're supposed to do things. And like I say, books later, chapters later, we find out where people did that and they got into big problems because they were led away from God. That has been a problem I face many times over the years of different skin color people getting together. Yes, sir. One of my brothers married a Caucasian mother from the moon, not the south, but the moon. But then it turned out one of the best storylines she's ever had. You had to pull that back. But so I said that's been used to keep everybody in their own quote unquote respective places. Yes, sir. I understand it because I grew up during that period of time in the South in the 50s and 60s. People tried to use the Bible to justify segregation. But if you read the Bible with an open heart and open mind and study the Bible, nothing was ever said about stay away from this group or that group because of who they were. It was because of what they did. It had to do with their worship. If they had been told to stay separate, why in the world did Philip ever get on that cart with the Ethiopian? And that's where people misuse and misrepresent the Bible a lot of times. But in the course of action here in the Bible, the only reason they were told to stay separate from a group was because God knew that they would be led off track when it dealt with God. Brother Clarence? Yeah. Correct. Skipping down to verse 18, we're getting into, we've already been told the next of kin there, which gets very specific. Now, we have to also understand that this is a change because prior to this, it was legal. It was legitimate. We wouldn't have had a populated world if it hadn't happened before this. But now we're getting to the point where there's enough people in the world that God comes in and says, stay away from next of kin. We can look at verse 18 for an example of this. Neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime. So if a man marries a woman that dies and then he marries the sister, everything's good to go. But two at a time. And if we go back into the Genesis chapter 29, who did Jacob marry? Well, he was tricked into it, forced into it, but who did he marry? Leah and Rachel. And what was happening between those sisters? I'm sure before Jacob came along, those sisters were very good friends, got along great. But what happened when he married and started showing favoritism? Those sisters didn't get along so well. And that's what it means. You don't do that to vex. And again, we got to look at it that today we're instructed not to do that. It's one man, one woman. But back in those days, they could have multiples. Verse 20, moreover, thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife, to defile thyself with her. First time we hear about this is back in the book of Exodus, the 10 Commandments, right? Thou shalt not commit adultery. Verse 22, thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination. Neither shalt thou lie with any beast to defile thyself. Therefore, neither shall any woman stand before a beast to lie down thereto. It is confusion. Why would we be told? Why would it have to be said that zoophilia or bestiality was wrong? Isn't that just a common sense thing? We have to remember the first statement that was made. Do not do like the Egyptians. Do not do like the Canaanites. Those things were taking place at that time in those cultures. God is saying, no, don't do it. And when he made the comment there that not to lie with mankind as with womankind, that is covered again in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 through 11 or so. Yes, ma'am. Well, with one exception, they're either mixing it or they're not doing anything with the New Testament, because, like I said, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, starting with verse 9, covers those again. And when he's talking, and I've had people tell me that, okay, they just didn't understand what was going on. You telling me Paul didn't have a good understanding of what was happening in Corinth when he wrote them the letter, and then 5 years after, or 4 or 5 years after he had been there and established the church? He had been there. He knew that they even had a phrase in that area, Corinthos, meaning people that would act like Corinthians. Corinth at that time was like San Francisco today, and well, combined San Francisco and Las Vegas. I mean, if you wanted to find it, go to one of those two places today. If you wanted to find it then, go to Corinth. And also, was Paul a literate, knowledgeable person or an illiterate? He was extremely knowledgeable. Well, one thing that we don't know generally today is that if he was that knowledgeable, he knew about the Roman Empire and all the Caesars, correct? 15 of the first 16 emperors of Rome committed homosexual acts. You think Paul didn't know that? And so then he writes chapter 6, verses 9 through 12. Brother Clarence? right? There's a lot that the New Testament reinforces, and again, the Old Testament being our schoolmaster, the New Testament reinforces a lot of those ideas. And again, in verse 26, it says, well, verse 23 through 25 is interesting. Oh, I switched chapters. I'm in chapter 19 now. Let me back up. Verse 24 of chapter 18. Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast you out of. That just reinforces what I've been saying, that they were not to act like the people that the nations they were coming in contact with. Verse 27 follows it up by saying, for all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. Verse 29, for whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them shall be cut off from among their people. Questions or comments on 17, 18? Yes, sir. Right. Okay. In chapter 19, starting with verse 1 through 8, that deals with the Lord as being holy. Verse 9 picks up by love your neighbor. By going in and saying, when you reap the harvest of your land, thou shalt not reap the corners of thy field, neither shalt thou gather the gleanings of thy harvest. And thou shalt not glean the vineyard, neither shalt thou gather every grape of the vineyard. Thou shalt leave them for the poor and stranger. I am the Lord. So what effect does it have not to glean a harvest? You leave some for your neighbor. I'm running out of time, so I'm not worried about how far I'll go. But when I was a youngster, cotton and corn pickers were just coming into being. I picked cotton by hand, pulled ears of corn by hand. But a neighbor had a picker. But once he went over the field one time, he left it. He allowed us to go back after that and pick up what was left over. And by that time, it was all dried and not good for human consumption, but we could gather it up to feed the hogs. I mean, you might have to tramp a whole acre to find a bushel of corn, but it was worth it because you could feed your hogs with it. Then verse 19 deals with a difference. It starts with keeping the statutes, 19 through the rest of the chapter. Ye shall keep my statutes. Verse 23 through 25. When ye shall come into the land and shall have planted all manner of trees for food, then ye shall count the fruit thereof as uncircumcised. 3 years shall it be as uncircumcised unto you. It shall not be eaten of. But in the 4th year, all the fruit thereof shall be holy to praise the Lord God withal. And in the 5th year shall ye eat of the fruit thereof, that it may yield unto you the increase thereof. I am the Lord your God. Is there any logical reason not to eat fruit from new planted trees the first 3 years? I see one head tentatively going this way. Yes, ma'am. It is just getting started. It's not as, if you're looking at a peach, it's not as juicy. It doesn't have everything there. It's working toward it. So in the 4th year, it's good. And what happens in the 4th year? It's the same way with the blood sacrifice. The first, God wants the fruit's ready to be eaten of. God gets it. And then the 5th year thereafter, man can have it. Sorry we ran out of time. Didn't even get through 3 chapters, but Appreciate all your comments and all your attention. Brother Clunch.